My name is Imogen Clarke. I'm 36 years old. And until recently, I was the kind of woman people described as steady. I live in Manchester, in a narrow brick terrace that always smells faintly of coffee and old books. I work in corporate finance for a mid-sized logistics company. Nothing glamorous, nothing dramatic. Spreadsheets, reconciliations, quarterly reports. The kind of job that rewards precision but rarely applauds it. If you had asked my colleagues to describe me, they would have said dependable, quiet, a bit reserved, the sort of person who stays late without announcing it and fixes errors without attaching her name to the correction. I was the woman who remembered passwords, who kept copies of everything, who double-checked numbers no one else thought to question. I don't think anyone saw that as power. They saw it as harmless. There's something about a calm woman in a room full of louder personalities. People mistake composure for passivity. They assume that if you don't interrupt, you won't resist. If you don't boast, you don't understand your own value. And if you don't defend yourself immediately, you must not have much to defend. This is the story of what happened when that assumption went too far. The official accusation was simple, clinical, even. They said I had been siphoning small amounts of money from internal accounts, adjusting figures, moving funds. It was presented as a concern, a discrepancy, a matter that required investigation. But the subtext was clear. I was being positioned as the quiet thief. What followed wasn't dramatic in the way people expect. There were no shouting matches in boardrooms, no slammed doors, no tearful confessions. There was a meeting. There was a printed report placed carefully in front of me, and there was a decision. I remember looking at the numbers they claimed were mine and feeling something unfamiliar. Not panic, not even anger. It was something colder than that. Clarity, because numbers tell stories, and login histories tell them even better. So I asked IT to pull the login records tied to the transactions in question. The timestamps led straight to my manager's account. But this story isn't about revenge. It's about perception. About the roles we're assigned without consent. About what happens when a woman who has always chosen calm decides to keep that calm, but use it differently. Over the next hour or so, I'm going to walk you through how I was seen, how I allowed it, what shifted inside me, and why the quietest decision I ever made changed everything. There won't be villains here, only choices and consequences. Have you ever been underestimated so completely that people forgot to be careful around you? Before the accusation, before the meeting, before anyone printed out those transaction logs with my name highlighted in pale yellow, I was useful. That's the word I think they would have chosen. Not brilliant, not strategic, not indispensable. Useful. I was the person who knew where archived invoices lived when the shared drive mysteriously reorganized itself. The one who caught decimal errors that would have skewed quarterly projections just enough to embarrass someone in upper management. The one who stayed calm when the system froze 10 minutes before a reporting deadline. But I was never the loudest voice explaining what I'd fixed. In meetings, I sat 2 seats from the end of the table, not at the far corner that would look disengaged, not near the head that would imply ambition. 2 seats from the end was a position that said, I'm here to contribute, not to compete. My manager, Daniel, filled the silence quickly. He was charismatic in the way people often reward quick with summaries, confident in tone, comfortable taking credit for team efforts. I don't say that with resentment. At the time, I genuinely believed that visibility simply worked that way. Some people stepped forward. Others ensured the ground was stable enough for stepping. I was grounded. When colleagues had questions, they often didn't email Daniel. They messaged me, Imogen. Do you know why this figure changed Imogen? Can you check if this aligns with last month, Imogen? Can you quietly look at something before I send it upstairs? Quietly? That word followed me like a shadow. I didn't mind, at least not consciously. There's a certain safety in being the competent background figure. You're rarely threatened, rarely scrutinized, rarely envied, and almost never defended. If praise came, it was soft. Imogen's very thorough. She's reliable. She doesn't cause problems. I can see now how that last comment was framed as a compliment. Doesn't cause problems. It implies something else, doesn't it? That causing problems is what ambitious people do. That questioning, challenging, and disagreeing, those are disturbances. I had built a reputation on smoothness, on not disturbing the surface. Outside of work, my life reflected the same pattern. I lived alone. I kept my circle small. I read more than I posted. I observed more than I announced. I carried my Navy notebook everywhere, not because I was paranoid, but because I trusted written records more than memory, dates, time, context. Details matter. But no one at work knew that about me. They saw efficiency, not awareness. They saw quiet, not calculation. When Daniel began excluding me from certain higher-level budget discussions, it didn't register as a threat. It felt like hierarchy. When my name slowly disappeared from email threads summarizing projects I had built, I told myself visibility wasn't my goal. When minor errors appeared in reports I hadn't finalized small enough to be dismissed, large enough to require correction, I assumed it was system lag, or oversight, or coincidence. I believed in coincidence. Most of all, they believed in my predictability. Imogen will fix it. Imogen won't react. Imogen will stay late. Imogen won't escalate. To them, I was a stable infrastructure, necessary but not central. An infrastructure doesn't defend itself. It simply absorbs pressure. What they didn't realize, what I didn't even fully articulate yet, was that infrastructure also records load patterns. It remembers stress points. It documents cracks. And I had been documenting far more than they understood. If I'm honest, the first cut didn't look like one. It looked like a meeting invite. Subject line: budget reconciliation, leadership review. I noticed my name wasn't on it because I had built the reconciliation model they were reviewing. Not conceptually, literally, the formulas, the cross-referencing sheets, and the macro that flagged discrepancies over 0.7%. I had stayed 2 late evenings refining it before the quarter close. And yet, when the calendar notification circulated through the department, my inbox stayed quiet. At first, I assumed it was an oversight. That happens in busy offices. Threads get long, names get missed. So I walked to Daniel's office doorway and knocked gently against the frame. "Just checking," I said evenly. Was I meant to sit in on the reconciliation review? He didn't look uncomfortable. That's important. He didn't look guilty. He smiled. "Oh, that one's just high level. Imogen, nothing technical. I'll represent the team." Represent the team? I remember nodding. It was such a small thing. So easy to accept. Hierarchy again. Efficiency. Why crowd a room with too many voices? But later that afternoon, when the meeting ended, I received 3 separate messages from colleagues. Imogen. They had a question about the variance threshold. Daniel said the model auto-adjusts quarterly. Did you change the macro settings? Leadership seemed confused. I think something was explained differently than how it works. Explained differently? I opened the shared drive and checked the timestamp on the live model. No edits. No updates. My documentation tab, the one that clearly outlined how the macro triggered, was still intact. It wasn't broken. It had been summarized, and in the summarizing, something subtle shifted. The model was no longer described as a risk control mechanism I had designed. It was reframed as a team tool Daniel helped refine. That was the first small cut. Not theft, not sabotage, repositioning. That evening, I stayed back not because I had to fix anything, but because I wanted to review the meeting minutes once they were uploaded. I compared them against my original documentation, line by line. There it was again. Language adjusted just enough to blur authorship. I could have corrected it. Sent a polite clarification email. Added context. But I didn't, and this is the part that matters. I told myself it wasn't worth it. I told myself credibility accumulates over time. That one meeting didn't redefine contribution. That precision speaks for itself. I rationalized silence as professionalism. A few days later, during a casual conversation in the break room, someone from operations said, "Daniel's been doing great work tightening up financial oversight lately." I smiled. "Yeah," I replied. "The oversight process is stronger this quarter." It was technically true. That's the danger of small cuts. They don't bleed immediately. They don't demand stitches. They simply reduce something ownership clarity, space by millimeters at a time. And because nothing explodes, no one notices. Except you? I went home that night and wrote in my Navy notebook. March 14th, reconciliation model presented without attribution, language shifted, monitor pattern, not emotional, not accusatory, just recorded. At that point, I still believed it was isolated, a communication misalignment, an executive simplification. I didn't yet understand that it was calibration, testing how much could be adjusted before I responded, testing how quiet I truly was. Tell me, have you ever felt something was slightly off, but convinced yourself it was too small to matter? After that first meeting, nothing dramatic happened, which, in hindsight, was the point. If something blatant had occurred, public criticism, direct accusation, obvious exclusion, I might have reacted. But what followed was softer, harder to name, easier to rationalize. Daniel began forwarding my completed reports to senior leadership with slight formatting changes. The structure remained mine. The analysis remained mine. Even the phrasing, in many cases, remained mine. But the cover email shifted. Following up on the adjustments I mentioned, I've reviewed the latest projections and refined the variance logic. Reviewed, I watched the language carefully. He wasn't claiming authorship outright. He was positioning himself as the final authority, the filter through which my work passed before it became legitimate. And because I never challenged it, that narrative stabilized. In meetings, he began answering technical questions directed at me. Someone would ask, "Imogen, how did you model the depreciation curve?" And before I could finish inhaling, Daniel would lean forward. What she did was create a rolling adjustment factor. Not incorrect, just incomplete. I could have interjected, clarified, expanded. Instead, I would nod once, as if to confirm his explanation. It wasn't fear. It was conditioning. I had been praised my whole life for being agreeable, for not escalating, for understanding office politics without being political. I told myself that correcting him in real time would look territorial, defensive, so I allowed the pattern. That's how normalization works. It doesn't demand your agreement. It only requires your tolerance. Over the next few weeks, I noticed something else. Small errors began appearing in finalized reports. Errors I hadn't made. A decimal shift here, a miscategorized expense there. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to require follow-up clarification. The first time it happened, I assumed I'd missed something. I stayed late reviewing my saved draft against the submitted version. They weren't identical. I compared timestamps. My final save 6:42 p.m., submitted version 8:13 p.m., edited by Daniel Harper. I stared at the audit trail longer than I needed to. There are moments when your brain presents two options. Option 1, coincidence. He adjusted formatting. A harmless tweak created unintended distortion. Option 2, intentional interference. I chose the gentler explanation. Again, the next time it happened, I saved a local PDF copy before closing the file. Not out of suspicion, I told myself. Just good practice. When a minor variance was flagged by leadership, Daniel sighed in the meeting and said, "We'll need to tighten up review controls." I felt the room tilt slightly. Not outwardly, internally. I said nothing. Afterward, a colleague pulled me aside. "Rough one," she murmured sympathetically. "I know you're usually more careful than that." Usually, that word echoed longer than it should have. I walked back to my desk, opened my notebook, and wrote, March 29th, file edited, post-finalization, pattern emerging, begin retaining independent copies. No accusation, no emotion. Just documentation. What unsettled me most wasn't the edits themselves. It was how quickly the narrative adapted around them. I was still seen as competent, but now with qualifiers. Reliable, but occasionally inconsistent. Thorough, but needing oversight. Capable, but junior. The role was shifting, and I was helping it shift by staying silent. Disrespect, when repeated gently enough, begins to feel procedural, like part of the workflow. You tell yourself this is temporary. This is politics. This is how visibility works. But somewhere beneath the rationalizations, something steadier was forming. Not anger, awareness. Because patterns, once seen clearly, can't be unseen. Have you ever realized too late that what you thought was patience was actually permission? There's a moment in every workplace where you understand, without being told, what role you've been cast in. not your job title, your function in the social ecosystem. By early spring, mine was clear. I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed pressure so others could perform with confidence, the one who ensured the numbers aligned before presentations, but didn't need to present them, the one who corrected inconsistencies quietly enough that no one had to acknowledge there had been inconsistencies at all. Reliable, useful, invisible. It wasn't overtly cruel. No one excluded me from lunches. No one mocked me in meetings. In fact, I was often complimented. We're lucky to have someone so detail-oriented. You're the backbone of this department. Backbone, it sounds strong. Structural, but backbones don't choose direction. They support it. I began noticing how tasks were distributed. High visibility assignments, strategy reviews, forecasting presentations, cross-department collaborations flowed upward toward Daniel, or sideways to colleagues more vocal in meetings. Technical cleanup work, reconciliations, audit preparations, and data validation that flowed toward me. The pattern was framed as trust. Imogen's the safest pair of hands. Safe. I'd become synonymous with low risk. And low risk in corporate language rarely advances. It maintains. One afternoon, during a quarterly planning session, a senior director asked, "Who built the original cost tracking matrix we're using?" There was a pause. A fraction of a second. Daniel replied smoothly, "That evolved from a framework I introduced last year. The team's been refining it." The team? I didn't correct him, but something inside me shifted, not sharply, not dramatically, more like a lens-adjusting focus, because I realized then that it wasn't about individual credit anymore. It was about the authorship of the narrative. If he were the architect, I would be the assistant. If he was the strategist, I was the implementer. And the longer I allowed that storyline to settle, the harder it would be to rewrite. I went back to my desk and opened the original file metadata for the cost tracking matrix. Created April 3rd, 18 months prior. Author Imogen R. Clarke. Modified numerous times. Contributor added Daniel Harper, 7 months later. Facts don't argue, they simply exist. But facts only matter if someone is willing to reference them. That was when I understood the role more fully. I wasn't being pushed out. I was being positioned beneath, not abruptly, gradually, a dependable second. Someone's leadership could be questioned without destabilizing the hierarchy. Someone's safe to attribute minor inconsistencies to if needed. Someone who wouldn't escalate concerns because she had built a reputation on composure. The role required 3 things: competence, silence, predictability. I had all 3, and I had reinforced all 3. The unsettling part wasn't that others expected me to play this role. It was that I had never clearly refused it. That evening, I didn't feel angry. I felt precise. I opened my notebook again. April 11th, perception solidifying, assigned role stabilizer, risk buffer, replaceable in narrative, essential in function. There's power in understanding how you're being framed, because once you see the frame, you can decide whether to remain inside it. Tell me, have you ever realized you were indispensable to the work, but optional in the story? The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during one of Daniel's careful summaries or after another edited report resurfaced with subtle distortions. It happened on a Tuesday evening at 7:18 p.m. under fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly unreal. I was alone in the office. Most of the team had left by 6. Daniel had stepped out earlier, mentioning a client dinner. The floor was quiet in the way corporate buildings get after hours, ventilation humming softly, computer screens casting pale rectangles across empty desks. I was reviewing a reconciliation sheet for internal expense transfers when I noticed something unfamiliar. A small transaction adjustment, £4,860. Not large enough to trigger the automated variance alert I had built, categorized as temporary reallocation, pending vendor clarification. That phrasing wasn't mine. I clicked into the audit history. Edited 652 user Daniel Harper. I felt a mild flicker of confusion. Not alarm yet. The transaction wasn't attached to my projects. It sat within a broader internal holding account used for operational buffers. I compared it against the source ledger. The original entry had been coded differently. The adjustment rerouted it through a secondary internal account before returning it to its original category. Circular, unnecessary, odd. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen longer than I needed to. There are moments when something isn't clearly wrong, but it isn't clean either. And I've always trusted clean. I exported the transaction history as a PDF, saved it locally, dated it, placed a note in my notebook. April 18th, internal transfer irregularity, no variance flag, monitor frequency, still no accusation, no conclusion, just observation. The shift didn't come from suspicion of wrongdoing. It came from a realization, if I hadn't been there that evening, if I hadn't happened to review that specific sheet, that adjustment would have dissolved into the monthly summary unnoticed. No system alert, no follow-up, no memory. And if something later appeared misaligned, the audit trail would show shared access to the account, shared responsibility. That was the moment. Not fear, not anger. Clarity. I wasn't just being repositioned socially. I was being positioned structurally. The stabilizer, the quiet one, the reliable pair of hands, the safest person to absorb future discrepancies. Because who would leadership believe if inconsistencies surfaced? The charismatic manager who introduced frameworks, or the meticulous analyst whose name already appeared beside minor corrected errors? I closed my eyes for a moment, not dramatically, just to slow my thinking. Up until that night, my silence had been habitual, polite, conditioned. After that night, it became intentional. If patterns were forming, I needed to understand them fully, not emotionally, systemically. I reopened the audit log and filtered for the past 90 days. Internal transfers, adjustments below the variance threshold, edits after 6 p.m. There were more than I expected. Small amounts of reclassified, reversed, moved, individually insignificant, collectively pattern. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't send an email. I shut down my computer at 8:04 p.m., slipped my notebook into my bag, and walked home through the cool Manchester air, feeling something unfamiliar settle into place. Resolve. Not to retaliate, not to expose, but to stop being passive infrastructure. If something was happening, I would understand it completely before I ever spoke. Because silence, when chosen deliberately, isn't weakness. It's positioning. That Tuesday wasn't the day I decided to fight. It was the day I decided to watch differently. Have you ever felt the exact moment when patience transformed into strategy? After that Tuesday, I didn't change how I behaved. That was the important part. I still arrived at 8:15. I still reviewed variance sheets before anyone asked. I still responded to messages with measured clarity. If anything, I became slightly more agreeable in meetings, slightly more neutral, but internally, something had recalibrated. Silence was no longer my default setting. It was a decision. There's a difference. Default silence is reflexive. It hopes tension resolves itself. It assumes fairness will self-correct. Chosen silence observes. I began tracking more than just transaction anomalies. I tracked timing, patterns of access, language shifts in email summaries, instances where I was verbally associated with minor discrepancies that did not originate from my files, not obsessively, systematically. I created a private folder on my encrypted home drive. Every exported audit trail, every final version PDF, and every metadata screenshot was labeled with date and time. Clean, organized, detached. At work, I remained the stabilizer. When Daniel edited a file after hours, I didn't react. I simply downloaded the new version and archived it beside the original. When small reclassifications appeared in holding accounts, I didn't flag them. I logged them. When leadership referenced tightening review controls, I nodded and offered to implement additional documentation procedures. That part was deliberate. If review controls were about to become the narrative, I would help formalize them. Maybe we should expand the login audit window, I suggested casually during one team discussion, just to ensure transparency across shared accounts. Daniel smiled. Good idea. Can you draft a proposal? Of course. I drafted a concise document outlining how enhanced audit logs could protect the department from compliance risks. I framed it as risk mitigation, not suspicion. Leadership approved it within a week. Ironically, the improved audit system would make future patterns clearer. Daniel seemed unconcerned. Why would he be from his perspective? I was still predictable, still cooperative, still non-confrontational. He mistook my stillness for safety. Others did too. A colleague joked one afternoon, "Imogen never gets ruffled. I don't think she has a temper." I smiled faintly. "It's inefficient." They laughed. What they didn't see was that my calm was no longer about avoiding conflict. It was about timing. There's power in letting someone believe you haven't noticed. Power in allowing a pattern to mature, because incomplete patterns can be dismissed as a coincidence. Fully formed ones are harder to explain away. Weeks passed. The small internal transfers continued, always below the variance threshold, always reclassified in similar ways, always accessed through shared credentials, though metadata increasingly showed after-hours edits tied to Daniel's login. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I asked IT an unrelated question one afternoon. "Out of curiosity," I said lightly, "how far back do detailed login timestamps go before archival compression?" "About 12 months fully granular," the technician replied. "After that, summaries." 12 months. Enough. I thanked him and returned to my desk. Silence, when strategic, isn't about suppression. It's about accumulation. By the time the accusation came, because it eventually did, I wasn't surprised. I was prepared, and that preparation changed everything about how I would respond. Tell me, have you ever let someone underestimate you long enough for them to reveal themselves completely? What they never noticed was that I stopped reacting internally long before I stopped appearing agreeable externally. There's a particular calm that comes when confusion is replaced by data. By May, I had built something parallel to my assigned responsibilities. Not a rebellion, an archive. Every transaction below the variance threshold over the past 6 months exported. Every after-hours edit tied to shared accounts, screen captured. Every instance where file metadata showed modification after my final submission, saved alongside the original. But documentation alone isn't leverage. Context is. So I began mapping patterns. I created a private spreadsheet at home, columns for date, time, account affected, original classification, adjusted classification, login credential used, and whether the transaction was later triggered inquiry. When laid out chronologically, the irregularities formed clusters. End of quarter pressure periods, weeks preceding leadership reviews, instances where cost overruns would have drawn attention if left unadjusted. The amounts were small enough to avoid audit flags, but consistent enough to suggest intention. And then I noticed something subtler. On 3 separate occasions, minor discrepancies were publicly attributed to team oversight within days of larger reclassifications being reversed quietly. The visible errors were small. The invisible adjustments were strategic. It was elegant in a way. If scrutiny ever intensified, the narrative would already exist occasional inconsistencies in reporting. Shared access, collective responsibility. I wasn't being framed abruptly. I was being softened, positioned as statistically plausible. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me meticulous. I began requesting written confirmations for final submissions. Just to ensure alignment, I'd phrase it. If Daniel verbally asked for a change, I followed up with an email summarizing it. Neutral tone, bullet points, time-stamped. I volunteered to present a short internal session on audit trail transparency, not accusatory, educational. I walked the team through how metadata functions, how login histories are recorded, and how shared credentials can blur accountability. Daniel sat through it without visible discomfort. He even complimented the clarity. What he didn't realize was that I was establishing awareness. If discrepancies later surfaced, no one could claim ignorance of how traceability worked. Preparation is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. Outside the office, I adjusted my routines too. I consulted a compliance policy manual I downloaded from the company's internal portal. I reviewed whistleblower procedures, not because I intended to use them immediately, but because I wanted to understand escalation pathways. I read our financial governance code line by line. There's a difference between suspecting something is wrong and knowing exactly which clause it violates. By early June, my private archive had grown substantial. Dates aligned, patterns repeated, login timestamps clustered around Daniel's after-hours access. Still, I said nothing, because the moment you accuse without being accused, you appear defensive. And I wasn't going to be defensive. I was going to be precise. The final piece of preparation came almost accidentally. While reviewing user access permissions for a quarterly audit checklist, I noticed that Daniel's login had administrative override capabilities on certain internal holding accounts. Override permissions don't automatically imply misuse, but They explain how adjustments bypass automated alerts. I printed the permissions matrix, saved it, filed it. What they never noticed was that I stopped being surprised. I stopped hoping the pattern would resolve itself. And I stopped assuming fairness would intervene organically. Instead, I let the structure continue exactly as it was. Because structures reveal themselves most clearly when uninterrupted. By the time the formal accusation arrived, when I was called into that quiet meeting room and presented with a curated selection of discrepancies tied to shared accounts, I already knew which timestamps they had chosen. I had them too. The difference was that mine were complete. Tell me if you knew someone was building a narrative around you. Would you interrupt it or let it finish? The accusation came on a Thursday morning. 9:12, calendar invite urgent, financial review discussion. Attendees Daniel, HR. One representative from internal compliance. No agenda attached. I walked into the meeting room with my usual notebook and a pen. No laptop. No visible defense. I didn't want to look prepared. They had printed documents waiting. That detail mattered to me. Printed, highlighted, tabbed. Physical evidence feels heavier than digital. Daniel began with the tone I recognized, the controlled disappointment managers use when they want to appear reluctant. We've identified a pattern of irregular internal transfers, he said. Several transactions adjusted under shared account access. Your credentials were active during some of these windows. Active, not exclusive, not sole access. Active. HR slid a document toward me. A list of dates, transaction IDs, amounts, all below automated alert thresholds. Carefully selected, I scanned the first page slowly. My expression didn't change, because I had seen these entries before. What they didn't know, what Daniel didn't know, was that the list in front of me was incomplete. They had pulled windows that showed shared login access during business hours. They had not included the after-hours override edits. They had not referenced the administrative permission matrix. They were presenting ambiguity as implication. I looked up calmly. May I ask, I said evenly, whether the login history for these transactions includes full timestamp granularity, including after-hours access and administrative overrides. There was a slight pause. Compliance glanced at Daniel. We've reviewed available records, Daniel replied. The concern is the pattern. I nodded once. The pattern matters, I agreed. Which is why I'd like IT to pull the complete login history for each transaction I delisted, including exact timestamps and credential origin. Silence doesn't always need volume to shift a room. HR adjusted her posture slightly. That can be arranged, she said. Thank you. I replied, I believe clarity will resolve this quickly. That was the moment of private reveal. Not because the truth had been exposed yet, but because I realized something with absolute certainty. They had assumed I would react emotionally, defend vaguely, argue context. They had not expected procedural confidence. They had not expected me to request expanded audit logs. The meeting adjourned with polite neutrality. IT would compile the full access history by the following afternoon. I returned to my desk and resumed work. Externally, nothing changed. Internally, everything settled. Because leverage isn't about surprise. It's about asymmetry. I already had the complete logs saved at home. I already knew the after-hours timestamps led consistently to Daniel's individual credentials, particularly during periods where adjustments predated visible discrepancies. But I wasn't going to present my archive preemptively. If I introduced it too early, it could be framed as defensive preparation. Instead, I would let the official system retrieve the same truth independently. There's a specific kind of calm that comes when you know the data will speak for you. Not dramatically, not vindictively, just clearly. That evening, I didn't celebrate. I didn't rehearse arguments. I sat at my kitchen table, opened my notebook, and wrote, June 22nd, formal accusation initiated. Requested full timestamp audit. Remain composed. Let the process unfold. No triumph, only clarity. The next day, at 3:47 p.m., I received a message from compliance. IT has completed the expanded login poll. We need to reconvene. I read it once, closed my screen, and allowed myself one slow breath, because I already knew what those timestamps would show. The timestamps led straight to my manager's account. Not occasionally, not ambiguously, repeatedly. Tell me when the truth is patient enough to surface on its own. Is confrontation even necessary? The second meeting felt quieter, not outwardly, The same room, the same table, the same filtered daylight pressed faintly against the frosted glass. But the atmosphere had shifted. Compliance entered first this time, not Daniel. That detail didn't escape me. They distributed updated printouts thicker stack, more pages, full timestamp granularity, IP origin logs, override permissions. No one began immediately. They didn't need to. The columns told their own story. Transaction ID, date, original entry time, modification timestamp, user credential. Daniel's name appeared with a consistency that eliminated coincidence. Not just during business hours under shared access. After 7 p.m., after 8 p.m., administrative override flag active. I didn't look at him. I looked at the paper as if reviewing neutral data. Compliance cleared her throat. The expanded logs indicate that the majority of post-entry adjustments were executed under Mr. Harper's individual credentials. Majority? Such a careful word. Daniel exhaled slowly. These were operational corrections, strategic reallocations to smooth reporting volatility. Strategic reallocations? I almost admired the phrasing. But the original concern, HR interjected gently, was the appearance of shared account activity during overlapping windows. Shared ambiguity had dissolved into individual traceability. Silence stretched. This was the moment. Not of exposure, of decision. I had options. Option 1, escalate immediately. File a formal misconduct complaint. Submit my private archive. Trigger an internal investigation that would likely extend beyond Daniel. Option 2, negotiate quietly. Protect my position. Allow the company to reframe the incident as a procedural misjudgment. Option 3, resign with documented clarity, preserving reputation while stepping away from a structure that had already shown its willingness to reposition me. Each option carried consequences. Escalation would be righteous but public, lengthy, possibly corrosive. Negotiation would be strategic but complicit in narrative smoothing. Resignation would be controlled but irreversible. I folded my hands neatly over my notebook. I would like the record to reflect, I said calmly, that I did not execute these adjustments. Nor was I aware of the override permissions applied after my submissions. Compliance nodded, making notes. Daniel began to respond but stopped. Because the data didn't require debate. I am prepared. I continued evenly at Powder to cooperate fully with any formal review process. That sentence mattered. It signaled confidence without aggression. The meeting ended without resolution. Leadership would evaluate findings. HR would assess policy implications. Corporate language for damage containment? As I walked back to my desk, the choice crystallized. I realized something fundamental. Even if I was cleared publicly, officially the narrative scar would linger. I would forever be the analyst involved in that internal audit issue. Staying would mean rebuilding trust in a structure that had already tested my silence. I didn't want to fight for space inside a frame that had once minimized me. So that afternoon, before any official conclusion was announced, I drafted a letter, not emotional, not accusatory, a formal notice of resignation, effective in accordance with contractual terms. I attached no archive, made no threats. I simply removed myself from the equation, because the most irreversible decision isn't exposure. It's withdrawal. Have you ever realized that winning the argument isn't the same as staying in the room? I didn't submit my resignation immediately. Timing matters. Instead, I scheduled a brief meeting with HR for the following morning before leadership could finalize their internal positioning. I wanted my decision to precede their narrative. When I handed over the letter, I kept my tone steady. I believe it's in everyone's best interest for me to transition out professionally. I said, given the circumstances. HR looked surprised. Imogen, the review isn't complete yet. I understand. I replied, this isn't reactive. It's reflective. That phrasing was deliberate. Reactive implies emotion. Reflective implies agency. They asked whether I intended to file a formal complaint. I'm confident the audit logs speak clearly. I said, I have no additional commentary at this time. No additional commentary. Another deliberate boundary. By midweek, leadership had initiated what they termed a process review. Daniel was temporarily relieved of certain administrative permissions pending assessment. The wording avoided implication, but internally. Everyone understood the shift. Still, no public announcement was made, and I made none. At my desk, I began organizing transition documents, clean handover notes, detailed process explanations, updated workflow maps. I treated my departure with the same precision I'd applied to every reconciliation sheet. Some colleagues sensed something was changing. "You seem calm," one of them said quietly. I answered. Because I was. Calm doesn't mean unaffected. It means decided. In the background, I consulted an employment solicitor not to pursue litigation, but to review my exit documentation. I ensured my resignation letter referenced irreparable breakdown of professional trust related to audit findings without assigning blame. Language matters. It preserves reputation without igniting conflict. On my final Friday will pray, compliance sent a brief internal update. Preliminary audit review indicates that certain administrative overrides were misapplied. Policy clarifications forthcoming. Misapplied? Such a sterile word for intentional action. Daniel did not come into the office that day. No dramatic farewell occurred. No confrontation in corridors. No whispered accusations. Just a quiet recalibration. I returned my access badge, signed exit forms, provided forwarding contact details. Before shutting down my computer for the last time, I deleted nothing. I altered nothing. I left a clean system behind me. Because integrity isn't proven through exposure, it's demonstrated through restraint. What no one noticed was that my resignation shifted risk. With me gone, the stabilizer disappeared, the reliable buffer, the predictable absorber of pressure. Any future discrepancies would no longer have a quiet counterpart to balance them, and leadership knew it. By removing myself calmly, I forced clarity without ever raising my voice. As I stepped out of the building that evening, the air felt different, not triumphant, not relieved, defined. Sometimes dominance isn't about dismantling a structure. It's about stepping away from it so it must stand on its own. Tell me, have you ever realized your presence was protecting people who didn't protect you? The consequences didn't arrive with announcements. They arrived with friction. On Monday morning, the first one I didn't walk into that building, my phone buzzed twice before 10. The first message was from a colleague in operations. Quick question, do you remember how the variance macro handles mid-quarter reclassifications? It's flagging something unexpected. I read it without responding immediately. By midday, another message followed. Different colleague. Strange audit alert triggered this morning. Daniel's asking if you changed any background settings before leaving. Before leaving, it was subtle, but I noticed the shift. My absence had already created inconvenience. Systems I had designed were behaving exactly as programmed only now. Without me there to quietly interpret them, they felt abrupt. By Wednesday, I heard through a former teammate that an external compliance consultant had been brought in to tighten controls. Tighten. Corporate language for scrutiny. The improved audit window I had proposed months earlier was now operating in full visibility. After-hours overrides no longer slipped beneath reporting summaries. Variance thresholds, once comfortably below alert levels, were now transparent to leadership dashboards. The structure had not collapsed. It had become exposed. Daniel returned to the office midweek. His administrative permissions remained restricted pending review. Meetings he once led were now chaired by a senior director. Again, no drama. Just displacement. Someone I trusted slightly more than the others called me that Thursday evening. It's tense, she admitted quietly. There's a lot of file backtracking happening. People are rechecking months of reports. I pictured it clearly. Folders reopened, metadata reviewed, timestamps scrutinized. The very systems I had once stabilized were now being examined without a buffer. What are they saying? I asked. Nothing specific. Just that things were handled inconsistently. Inconsistently? Another sterile word. No one publicly referenced my name. No apology was issued. No dramatic clearing of reputation took place. But something more telling happened. Leadership circulated a memo emphasizing individual credential accountability and strict adherence to override authorization protocols. It was the kind of memo that only appears after someone tests the boundary. The narrative had shifted not toward scandal, but toward caution, and here's what mattered most. No one suggested I had stolen anything anymore. The implication dissolved quietly, because once the complete login histories were acknowledged internally, sustaining the original suspicion required ignoring documented fact. Organizations prefer containment over contradiction. I didn't need vindication in headlines. I needed the truth to settle into record. Over the following weeks, I heard that Daniel had taken personal leave. Then, he was pursuing opportunities elsewhere. Corporate phrasing for exit without spectacle. I never contacted him, never requested an apology, never forwarded my private archive. I didn't need to. The system corrected itself once the stabilizer was removed. What surprised me most wasn't the tension inside that office. It was the stillness in my own life. Without the daily effort of absorbing quiet distortions, my energy felt cleaner. I slept more deeply. I read without distraction. I began interviewing elsewhere not defensively, but selectively, because the greatest consequence wasn't what happened to him. It was what no longer happened to me. Tell me, have you ever stepped away and watched a structure struggle without the support it once took for granted? Left. I received an email from a senior director. Subject line: request for clarification. Polite, neutral. He explained that, during the extended audit review, additional historical adjustments had surfaced. Leadership was conducting a comprehensive reconciliation across the previous fiscal year. They wanted to ensure continuity of understanding regarding certain reporting frameworks I had originally designed. Continuity of understanding. It was almost gentle. I read the message twice before responding. I agreed to a short call, not because I felt obligated, but because clarity, once established, shouldn't be withheld. The call lasted 22 minutes. They asked technical questions, how the variance macro interacted with override permissions, whether shared credentials could obscure user origin, and whether alert thresholds had ever been manually adjusted. I answered precisely. No commentary beyond fact. At one point, there was a pause. The director sighed softly. It appears, he said carefully, that some override practices were inconsistent with policy. Inconsistent again. Language smoothing over panic. I could hear it beneath his tone, the awareness that this wasn't a minor deviation. Months of reporting integrity were now under review. External auditors had been notified. The board had requested an internal governance update. Damage control had escalated quietly. What would you recommend, he asked, to prevent similar issues in the future? That question lingered, because prevention is a forward-looking word. It implies recognition. I would recommend, I said calmly, eliminating shared credential access entirely, restricting override permissions to dual authorization, and formalizing immutable audit logs accessible to compliance in real time. There was silence on the other end. We're implementing something similar, he admitted. Of course they were. After the call, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt distant, because the moment to fix it had passed long before my resignation. The fix had been available during the first small cut, during the language shifts, during the subtle reclassifications, during the accusation itself. But organizations, like individuals, often respond only when risk becomes undeniable. Over the following weeks, news traveled through old contacts. Daniel had formally resigned. No public explanation. No disciplinary headline. Just absence. Some colleagues expressed regret not about the audit findings, but about how things were handled. They wished I had stayed, that we could have cleared the air. Clearing the air requires shared honesty, and honesty had not been offered when it mattered. By the time systems were tightened and policies rewritten, the trust architecture had already fractured. And trust, once fractured, rarely restores to its original shape. I didn't feel bitterness, but I did feel finality. Because too late isn't about punishment. It's about an opportunity expired. Had anyone asked me earlier, truly asked, I might have helped reinforce the structure from within. Instead, the structure chose opacity until transparency became unavoidable. And by then, I was gone. Tell me, have you ever watched someone try to repair something only after it was no longer yours to protect? I saw Daniel once more. It wasn't planned. 3 months after my resignation, I attended a regional finance conference in Leeds. New role, new company, same industry. I was reviewing a panel schedule when I sensed someone pause slightly behind me. Imogen. His voice was the same, measured, controlled, but thinner somehow. I turned. He looked different. Not disheveled, not defeated, just recalibrated. The confidence that once filled space so easily now seemed contained within it. Daniel, I said calmly. There was no rush of adrenaline. No rehearsed speech waiting behind my teeth. Just recognition. We stepped aside from the main corridor, near a tall window overlooking the city. Neutral territory. I wanted to say, He began carefully, that the situation at the company became complicated. Complicated. I let the word settle between us. I imagine it did, I replied. He studied my expression, perhaps searching for accusation or resentment or an invitation to argue. I never intended for it to escalate, he continued. The adjustments were strategic, short-term smoothing. It got away from me. That was the closest he would come to acknowledgement. Not admission, not an apology, just distance from the outcome. I nodded once. The audit logs were clear. I said, that's what mattered. He exhaled, a small shift in posture. I didn't expect you to request the full timestamp pull, he admitted quietly. There it was. Not anger. Surprise. They had miscalculated my response. I prefer complete data, I said evenly. Partial views create inaccurate conclusions. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked out the window. I suppose I underestimated you. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't heavy. Just factual. Yes, I said gently. You did. No edge, no triumph. Because dominance doesn't require humiliation. He didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't offer it. There was nothing to negotiate. We stood there briefly. Two professionals who had once occupied the same structure, now separated by consequence. I hope your new role suits you, he said. It does, I replied. And that was it. No raised voices, no emotional unraveling, no attempt to rewrite history. The confrontation had no heat because heat wasn't necessary. The truth had already done its work. As he walked away, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt confirmed. Underestimation is a quiet gamble. Sometimes it pays off. Sometimes it reveals exactly who was paying attention all along. Tell me if someone admitted they misjudged you. Would that be enough? I work differently now. Not louder, not sharper, just clearer. In my new role, head of financial controls for a growing tech firm, I still carry my Navy notebook. I still review audit trails personally. I still sit calmly in meetings while others speak too quickly. But there is one difference. I no longer allow narrative to drift unattended. If I design a framework, I present it. If I finalize a report, my authorship is documented in the summary. If language begins to blur contribution, I clarify it immediately, not defensively, simply accurately. I'd like to add context to that. I'll say evenly, just to ensure precision. Precision has become my boundary. I'm not harsher. I'm not suspicious of everyone, but I am attentive in a way that is no longer naive. The experience didn't make me bitter toward leadership structures. It made me aware of how easily silence can be interpreted as consent, and how quickly competence can be repurposed if you don't claim it. In my current team, shared credentials are prohibited. Override permissions require dual authorization. Audit logs are reviewed monthly, not reactively. Not because I distrust people, but because systems protect integrity better than personality ever can. Sometimes junior analysts ask how I remain so calm during high-pressure reviews. I tell them the truth. Calm isn't the absence of conflict. It's the refusal to let emotion replace data. I don't tell them the whole story, but I do tell them this. Document your work. Clarify your contributions. Don't confuse silence with strength unless it's chosen. Personally, I've changed in smaller ways too. I speak sooner. Not aggressively, just early. The first small cut doesn't get normalized anymore. If language shifts in a way that diminishes accuracy, I correct it. If credit disperses inaccurately, I re-anchor it. And interestingly, the more I do this calmly, the less resistance I encounter. Because confidence delivered without hostility unsettles fewer people. I no longer sit 2 seats from the end of the table by instinct. I sit where the conversation requires me. There's no anger attached to what happened, only integration. Daniel underestimated me because I allowed myself to be framed as safe, predictable, and non-disruptive. Now, I'm still calm, still measured, but not easily framed. Dominance, I've learned, doesn't require noise. It requires clarity sustained over time, and I have that now. Tell me what would change in your life if you stopped waiting to be fully seen and simply made yourself precise. When people hear this story, they often expect a dramatic ending. A public apology, a scandal, a moment where someone stands up in a crowded room and says, I was wrong. But real life rarely arranges itself around cinematic closure. There was no spectacle, no headline, no emotional reckoning delivered in raised voices. There were audit logs. There were timestamps. There was silence used differently. and there was a decision to leave before I allowed myself to be reshaped by a structure that had already tested my integrity. If there's a moral here, it isn't about revenge. It's about authorship. You can be indispensable to the work and still be optional in the story if you don't claim your place in it. You can be calm without being compliant. You can be quiet without being weak. And sometimes the most powerful response to an accusation isn't an argument. It's evidence. I don't hate Daniel. I don't replay the meeting in my mind. What happened revealed something essential to me. Underestimation is not an insult. It's information. It tells you how visible your boundaries are. It tells you whether your silence is being respected or repurposed. The day they accused me of stealing company funds, I didn't defend myself with emotion. I asked IT to pull the login history. The timestamps led straight to my manager's account, and I let the data do what anger never could. If you've ever been misjudged, overlooked, quietly repositioned into a role you didn't choose, this is your reminder. Clarity is stronger than outrage. Documentation is stronger than denial. And walking away can be louder than staying to win. Now I'm curious, if you were in that room, would you have confronted him publicly? Or would you have let the timestamp speak?